today is continuing on from where Pastor Dan has been preaching in Romans. So we are going right into Romans 13, 8 through 10. And this is the Christians and Love section, which is completely appropriate considering the age and the stage that we're living in. The world is very quickly tearing itself apart. And the response of Christians and love becomes paramount for what we're doing and where we're going. So let's go into our text and let's see what it says today. Owe no one anything except to love one another, for he who loves one another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. And if there is any other commandments, all are summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. Now, this is an important passage to understand, and when we begin it, it has a misnomer attached to it. Now, depending on your version, the way that you read this passage, you may have verse 8 disconnected and kind of hanging down further down in your page, and you might look at that and think that Paul is now speaking about something else. And when we start off with verse 8, owe no one anything, there's a popular misbelief or misunderstanding about this passage. The first one is people get very tied up in debt about it. They're like, oh, we shouldn't have any debt. Owe no one anything except to love one another. And the focus of the passage becomes not having debt. That is not what Paul is speaking about. If we were to look at the text in its context, we would realize that it is a continuation of verse 6 and 7. But the way that we know that it's not, again, is because of just what Scripture teaches. So it's not about debt, and it's not about borrowing money. It's not about the sin of having debt over your head. In fact, the Bible speaks time and time again about healthy debt and how you can have debt. Exodus 22:25. If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you are not to act as a creditor to them. You shall not charge him interest. Leviticus 25:35 and 37, Deuteronomy 15:7, Nehemiah 5:7. All of these things continually talk about how the appropriate way to hold and handle money is, and how debt can be a thing that can be done with wisdom and integrity. That's another sermon. We're not going to talk about that. So we're going to put all of that aside, and we're going to focus on the passage today. So when we look at 6, 7, and 8, we realize that there is a larger connection to what Paul is saying. We realize that he is talking about submission and honor to authority. He's speaking about how to interact with people who are adamantly opposed to you and who are different in every way, but he's also recognizing the need for honor and submission to roles of authority. And so if we were to go back to 6, this is what he had just said and what Pastor Dan preached on last week. For because of this, you also pay taxes. They are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render, therefore, to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. And this connection of owe no one anything except the debt of love is an immediate afterthought of verse 7, which means that he is speaking to the way that we owe people the debt of love. Specifically, the way that we interact with love in the roles that God has given us. So we are called to honor and submit to the roles that God has put in front of us. Children to parents. This is the first thing that we see as the roles that God gives us. Children to parents. Honor your parents and love them, for it will go well with you. So this role between children and parents is something that God would say, this is an important picture that I need you to learn. It's wives to husbands saying, the marriage that I've given you, this covenant relationship, is a bigger picture of something else. Younger to older, make sure that you follow wisdom and understand that those who are ahead of you are leading the path, and we are to honor and submit to them. Church to elders, as the way that God has created the church and the structure of the church. He puts Christ as the head, but as the elders to oversee the work of the ministry. People over creation. We see in Genesis that God gives us dominion in the world that we live, and he says, this is your role. Honor it and follow me. Submit and honor me, and the world is yours. People to the government, this thing that we've been talking about, how do we submit and honor the government? All of these, every single role comes to the conclusion of everybody under God. And so when we consider roles and when we consider structure and when we consider authority, Paul is making the point that all of this authority comes back to the focal point of submitting to God. So when we understand our roles and our order of surrender, it should always be a picture of who God is in our life. And so now going into that, that's where our text is. That's where our passage is. We can begin to understand what it means when it says, owe nobody anything except for the debt of love. And so we have to understand what that debt is and how do we live it out. I believe this is an important and essential thing because we live in a world where people are walking around angry. It is not difficult to see how angry and volatile this world is. I could take a poll in this room today and we would see just story after story of how much hatred and toxicity you've interacted in with this last week. And sometimes it's from believers, and sometimes it's from your neighbor, and sometimes it's from your government, and sometimes it's from your children. Sometimes it's from your parents, and sometimes it's from your spouse. Sometimes it's from your coworkers. But whatever it is, the level of anger and frustration that is normal seems to be heightened in this last years that we've been living, and just the style of things that are happening. The level of anger is obvious. And so then we have to understand that the reason that we're here today is very specifically ordained, that God would make us a people for such a time as this, that he would say, I want love and Christians to be known in the world that they live in. And so Paul says, owe no one anything except the debt of loving one another. Paul's point here is simple. It's an assertion that whatever debt we owe, we must repay. And that's the nature of debts for us. If we owe something, out of integrity and honor, our role is to pay it back. But this is unique because the debt that we all owe is the debt of love. If any of us or all of us have put our faith in Christ, it means that he paid the ultimate price for your sin and your transgression. And he did the same for me. Jesus willingly and freely paid it all, not with gold or silver, for God is much more precious than those things, but he paid for it with his very blood, with his very life. He did the work that nobody could do, and he willingly sacrificed himself so that any could be redeemed. Now, if you're sitting here today under that redemption, if your price has been paid, you are now carrying with you a debt. The debt that we carry as believers is the debt of love. And this is important to understand, that the debt of love that we owe could never be repaid. There is no amount of work, no amount of service, no amount of care for other people that we could ever speak into anybody's life and do anything close to what God has done for us. But Christians owe an immeasurable debt of love. And understanding that as we approach our text today is everything. If we understand that if Jesus paid it all and that he's given us life and breath, we carry with us a debt that cannot be paid. But Paul says, owe no one anything except to love one another. And so the idea, the understanding then is that this debt will not be paid off, but we will carry it for as long as we live. This is the parameter and this is the guardrail by which Christians must live and operate. We so quickly forget this debt and we live however we want. Selfishly, I would do things that are only for my own good or my own family's good. Selfishly, I would invest only in myself and take care of only myself. But when I recognize that God's role for my life and my family and this church is that we would love each other and we would move forward with this immeasurable debt, recognizing that there's nothing that we can do to repay it, but everything to do to live under it. And that's the gospel. That's the gospel message, is that Jesus paid it all. We couldn't do it, so he did do it. And the life that we now live is his to do what he wants with it. And he says, here's this debt of love. So now you carry it with you. See, but God delights to use the love of his Christians to reveal the gospel message. So he is using the lives of people to point back to what he already did. And so Jesus is moving and working through the lives of his people to, out of an abundance, express his love and his joy in us. So the debt of love begins to take a different picture. And Paul puts it this way, in a very unique way. He says that this idea of love is actually everything. He says that this idea of love trumps everything. He says that in Romans 13:8, the second part of 8 and into 9, he says this: "For he who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. And if there is any other commandments, all are summed up by saying this, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Now, to be clear what we're talking about, the Bible has over 613 laws that are connected to God's role and authority. 613, and we typically know the Big Ten, and in fact, Paul just quoted 4 of the 10 commandments. And they're probably the one that everybody knows. Like, you could go down to a person on the street and say, what do you know about the 10 commandments? And they'll typically get those 4. It is the general consensus of what it means to be good to somebody else. And yet, Paul is saying that all of the commandments, all 613 laws, are all summed up with love your neighbor. Really? Like, I mean, when I read that, like, I almost think it's not true. I read that and I think, if that were true, why wouldn't God just say, love your neighbor as yourself? Why would he give 613 laws for people to live by and to follow, when if it's all summed up with one thought, love your neighbor as yourself? Isn't that far simpler? And wouldn't people have a much greater success rate of doing the thing that God wanted them to do if he just said, love your neighbor as yourself? But there's so much more to this context and so much more to the understanding of the law. It begins with what Paul uses in a very unique word. It's almost exclusively used in this passage. When he uses the word all summed up, he is using a Greek word that only changes one other place. And I'm not a Greek scholar, so it's all Greek to me, but whenever I use a Greek word, you know it's good. The Greek word that we're going to learn today is anakepalaio. So you can say it if you can remember it, but it's anakepalaio. And anakepalaio is used only one other time. So Paul uses it here very intentionally. It sums up the law, anakepalaio. Ephesians 1:10 is the other time that it's used. If we were to look at Ephesians 1:10, this is what Paul wrote again. And this is the plan. At the right time, he will bring everything together under the authority of Christ. Everything in heaven and everything on earth. anakepalaio, this everything together, this idea of being summed up. It is the connection of saying that all of the things of heaven and all of the things of earth are brought up under the authority of Christ, that he is the rule, he is the authority, and if we submit to him, if our relationship is right with him, then the other laws fall into place. And this is an important distinction that we frequently miss. We believe that the laws and the commandments are regulations for us on how to interact with people, when we should be looking at the law as a way of understanding a relationship to God. See, the 10 Commandments, the first 4 of them, are all about a relationship with God. And out of a relationship with God, we can then turn to a relationship with people. Because if we don't get the relationship with God correct, we will always miss the relationship with man. And so Paul rightly and accurately sums it up and says, the answer to the problem of this world is love. Love your neighbor as yourself. And in truth, we never could and we never would without a relationship to God. And so the answer is the sum of the problem, but the reality is that Christ is the common denominator. Without Jesus, we cannot and will not live the life that he's called us to live. He said the very thing in Matthew. Matthew 22, 36 through 40 said, "Teacher," as this lawyer comes to Jesus, wondering how he can interact and what he can do to make it right. "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment?" Jesus replied, "Love. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment." And then he immediately turns. The lawyer didn't ask this question, but Jesus gives him the answer. The first is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and body. The second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus again said this very thing. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. The reason that 613 laws are given versus just these 2 is because people need application. People need to know what situation it is and how to interact with it, when in reality what we need is interpretation. We need to know that God is saying, the most important thing in this world is your relationship with me. If you get this right, if you understand who I am in relation to you, every other relationship falls into place. So when I talked about the tension between children and parents, the tension between wives and husbands, the tension between employers and workers, the tension between government and people, the tension between people and creation, and the tension between everyone and God, the reality is clear that a relationship with God allows us to understand what to do with people. And so Paul says that if you understand these things, you'll understand the entirety of the law. You won't need to know all 613. You'll need to know to love your neighbor as yourself. We know that the only way that we can carry that debt is that we would do it through the love of Christ in us. But what does loving your neighbor mean? Because we say these things and we don't quite get them. But before we get that, we want to know that Christ's love and law are satisfied by loving others as yourself. And so all of the law, all of the commandments are wrapped up with a nice little bow that says, this is everything, the summation of what I've said. Here is Christ. And so then the question then does become, what does it mean? Because every single person asks this question. How should I treat my neighbor? And many of them have different answers, and many of them are compelled to do things that they wouldn't do, or they feel guilty to carry the weight for people. And we wrestle, how far is too far, or what's the right answer? And we have pictures of Jesus loving his neighbor, but we have things that we need to be able to understand. The first one is what it is and what it is not. And knowing what love is and what love is not creates the pathway for us to be able to understand what God would want us to do in each and every situation. We don't have to have 613 laws to tell us how to interact with neighbors. We just need to know what love is and what love is not, and have Christ as the center of both. Verse 10 begins to answer this question of what love is. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. This necessary reminder, this idea that love does not harm other people is essential. Loving God rightly creates conviction in us to love our neighbors. It makes us burdened for where they're at, and it gives us compassion to see their hurt and their need. Love makes us see people differently, and then out of that burden, we choose to act. As we choose to act, it must always be an extension of our relationship to God. Very often in my own life, when I try to do something, I sometimes have manipulative pursuits behind it. If I love my wife this way, then I get 3 hours of playing video games later. Like whatever you do, right? Like whatever you want, sometimes we think that if we put love into the equation, then we get something back out of it. But the truth is that love considers somebody else first and not what we get out of it. And so loving our neighbors must be a relationship extension of God. So it must be looking at our neighbor and wishing that God was mixed into the conversation. Wishing that our neighbors could see God the way that we see God, not about what I do for them or how I treat them. When I see my neighbor, I should have the burden that they need the love of God also. And Paul put it that one of the best standards is that it would never do any harm. We would say it this way: Christian love doesn't harm its neighbor. And this is the first and real standard that we must have, is that Christian love doesn't harm its neighbor. And so when he quotes the 10 Commandments, and he says, you shall not murder, you shall not covet, you shall not lie, you shall not commit adultery. And then he sums it up and says, whatever other commandments there might be, the other 610, 609, he says, at its core, we don't harm our neighbors. We can't hurt them. Whatever you do for them shouldn't be for your benefit, but for theirs. It should be an extension of God's love and not you just being friendly. It shouldn't be something that you just do because you do it, but it should always be connected to them seeing Christ in you. And so our third point today is that Christian love doesn't harm its neighbor. So that's what it doesn't do. Or that's what it does do. And there's a problem with this. It's that too many people take this idea of not harming your neighbor and they twist it. And they believe that you can love your neighbor by not harming them, and so then you must do everything that they want you to do. See, loving your neighbor does not mean this. It does not mean that it'll do things that compromise who you are. I know that this will sound weird, but I fear that Christians sometimes try to love their neighbor, but actually end up harming their neighbor for the whole point of not harming their neighbor. So they think if I do this good thing for them, it'll be the right thing and they'll be blessed. But I believe that actually harms them more than helps them. It is not the loving thing to do to harm your neighbor. And so I'm going to give you some scenarios of what I believe loving your neighbor does not look like. Loving your neighbor is not complacent and silent to wickedness and injustice. Loving your neighbor doesn't sit by as you know that there's abuse or hurt going on. Well, they're my neighbor and I don't want to get involved. The loving thing is to just give them their space. No, the loving thing is to step into the situation. The loving thing is to begin to bring confrontation to the conflict that already exists. Loving your neighbor is not being bullied into accepting lies. Whatever you say I have to do is the way to love my neighbor. and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. Well, that's not loving your neighbor, is by accepting lies that you know are wrong. And so the believer is not loving their neighbor when they just sign off and do things because everybody's doing them, and that's what you should do. Loving your neighbor is not letting your neighbors willingly harm others. Whether through word or deed, the way that we speak needs to be rooted firmly in truth and love. We cannot step into this world and direct and dictate the things that happen. But likely so, the world can't step into our lives and direct us into what we should do and not do, claiming the slogan of love your neighbor as yourself. I've heard this slogan so frequently of love your neighbor as yourself, spoken to a world who hates and despises God, but wants me to follow what they do. So they quote scripture to me, but they don't know that the scripture really is connected back to the love of God. More than me doing something, I want them to see Christ in me doing something. Loving them cannot do them any harm, but it also then changes it to this place. It means that the perception of love is not the same thing as love. And when we use these terms incorrectly, when we say that, oh, love is not harming your neighbor, so then you get to do everything that I tell you to do because you don't get to hurt me. But in that same vein, our fourth one is that the perception of love is not the same as love. And we need to be wise and discerning on how to understand what true love is. Because I can't have the world define for me what godly love is because they don't know the God of the universe. Their understanding of roles and authority, submission and honor are wildly different than the Bible's. And so I need both. I need to honor and submit to the areas that I need to. I need to owe what I owe, and I need to pay what I pay. But when it comes to the definition of love, and it comes to the definition of a relationship with God, nobody but God can define that. And so then we respond with true love, recognizing that the perception of love is not the same as Christian love. And having the wisdom and the discernment to do that is everything. Personally, I wonder and I recognize what is the best way to love my neighbors. I look out and I see the neighbors in my neighborhood. I could tell you their names and parts of their life. I recognize that this conversation of loving your neighbors is much bigger than my neighborhood. I have to carry the burden of knowing that everyone is my neighbor, regardless of what country they live in. I recognize that everyone is my neighbor, regardless of what faith they have. Everyone is my neighbor, regardless of what they believe or what they do. So now I both step into my physical neighborhood. I have a responsibility for the people around me, but I also have a responsibility to my neighbors as believers. I have a responsibility to my neighbors as unbelievers. I have a responsibility to live out Christian love in the world that I live, the entire world. And people get hung up in these 613 laws. Can God's love really be summed up with just love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and body, and love your neighbor as yourself? Now, we saw in Ephesians 1:10 that Paul is making the claim that all of those things, heaven and earth, are tied together perfectly. And people have frequently asked me, they say, Joel, what is the most loving thing to do in this situation? Should I do A or should I do B? How do I love people? How do I love things that I don't agree with? How do I go along with things that are wrong, but people are claiming that it's the love of God? What should I do? The Jews had the 613 laws for all of those little intricate details. Jesus sums them up in 2, and so then I typically wander through 5 questions. As I wonder through, is it the right thing for me to do? Is this Christian love or not? Here are the 5 questions that I typically ask a person. Does loving my neighbor cost me? Because if it doesn't cost you, it's probably not love. Every example of love that I've ever seen has cost the person to give it to me. So if love doesn't cost me something, it's probably not love. Does loving my neighbor convict me? Meaning, is there something in my heart that needs to change so that I can go to the person and begin to become Christ to that person? If it doesn't convict me, it's probably not from God. Does loving my neighbor cause me to compromise my convictions? Meaning, I believe God said this, and this is who I am, and this is where I'm supposed to be. But the way that they want me to love them is going to compromise my convictions. All the time when you're compromising your convictions, it is not from God, because your convictions are from the Holy Spirit. And so then you need to be able to respond to that third question of, if it is something that compromises the conviction that I have, I will not and must not do it. To do anything else would be unloving to them. The 4th question comes right from our text. Does loving my neighbor harm them, or does it hurt them? There's a lot of instances where the perception of love hurts somebody much more than actually loving them. When somebody wants love that is not love the way that it should be, and when we go along with that and we pretend that that's love, that's far more damaging than most of the harm that we do is when we pretend a lie, or when we pretend that something is true that isn't true. The 5th one is the one that I most frequently ask myself. This is the question that as I began to live as a married life, as I begin to look at my children, as I find myself at different times when I've done different jobs, as I look to my family, my parents, as I look to my neighbors and my enemies, the people who despise me and want nothing to do with me. This is the question that I typically ask, because I wonder, God, do I really have to love them too? Do I really have to love the people who just absolutely hate me and want to have nothing to do with me? Isn't really the best way to love them just to love them at a distance and just kind of keep them in their corner and I'll stay in mine? But the question that I most frequently ask when I feel like I don't want to move forward is loving my neighbor, making my neighbor see Christ in me. That is the thing that compels me to frequently step out into areas where there is conflict or hurt. Can Christ be seen in this situation? Because my absence of the situation, Jesus won't be seen. And so now I need to purposely go into the conflict, go into the areas where people don't love me, where my neighbor hates me and is opposed to me. And I need to learn how to walk with them for our 5th and most important thing. Christian love reveals Christ. You see, Christian love that doesn't reveal Christ is not Christian love. It is just doing things. Every time that we step out in love, we should recognize this about Galatians 2:20. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Christian love always reveals Christ. It should not be my life living. The debt that I carry is an unpayable, immeasurable debt. And it means that whenever the situation arises where the thing would be the most loving to do, it's typically going to cost me. It's typically going to convict me. It's typically going to not compromise my convictions. And it's always going to reveal Christ. And that's how I begin to operate and understanding that all of the law can be summed up by saying, love your neighbor as yourself. Because if your relationship with God is right, then your relationship to other people will be right. We cannot and will not ever pay off this immeasurable debt. It is just too heavy for us. The difference of being spiritually dead to being spiritually alive is everything. And when Jesus reached into our lives and redeemed us, he paid a price that was unpayable. He gave us a debt that there's no way to pay back. But he does allow us to, through his Spirit, interact with his presence in this world. And he says, now that I've been saved you, now that you've been redeemed, go with me into this world and let's go love others the way that I've loved you. The words I have loved well enough are not in the Christian's vocabulary. The words I have done everything that I could do are not an option for the believer. When we consider Christian love, it must be through Christ and for Christ, because it takes us right back to the beginning of our verse, which is this idea that the authority and the roles that God gives us are always a picture of his relationship to us. Every interaction, every person, every role, every structure, every institution, every government should be a picture of our relationship to God. As we honor God, we learn how to honor the others.